ask yourself, maybe rightfully, why a Russian guy is moderating a China session. I can tell you that I've been based in China for more than 8 years now and covered China for major Russian media like all this time, so I have some understanding of what's happening with Chinese economy now. And as self-proclaimed China hand, I really can appreciate the quality of the panel we have today. We have 3 great experts, all coming from a bit different fields, so they can really give us some ideas of what's happening with M&A market from different perspectives. With this, let me introduce our speakers. First is Mr. Al Ernest. He's a principal and senior operations leader at East-West Association. He has an extensive resume here in the brochure, so I don't want to read everything. But what is important for me is that he has a 30 years experience working with American and Chinese companies, and he actually has been a plant manager in China. And I think that every China expert has to go through managing a plant there, because without it you can't really understand what it is to work in China and how hard it is to get things done there. Our second panelist is Mr. Alex Hao. He is now a partner at Junhe company. It's a Chinese company, but before that, again, he's been practicing law in New York, in Singapore, in Beijing, in Hong Kong. He told me that he actually went to college in Beijing and still considers Beijing his spiritual home, if I quote you correctly. And he just came back from China actually 3 weeks ago, so I hope that he can share some insights from a very extensive network of China lawyers that Junhe has there. I think it's 700, right? It's 700 lawyers.
Almost 700 lawyers.
Yeah, that you have there. And finally, last but not least, of course, is Professor Ann Lee. She's the author of the What the US Can Learn from China book. And again, she's been a macroeconomic professor in Peking University. She's been teaching in many other institutions in the States. She's a frequent commentator on the various channels, and she speaks a lot at the forums. And she told me that she's been asked almost every question about China already.
So now we have a challenge here. So if you manage to ask a question to Ann Lee that no one asked before, I have a small present for you. A nice bag of Chinese tea. So please prepare a good question for Ann Lee. We'll have enough time for Q&A. So with this, let's start with you, Ann Lee. Let's start from the American perspective. China was one of the topics of the first panel today, and there have been lots of talks about slowdown in China. But if you watch China for several years, you might remember that China's government actually wanted to slow the economy for many years. And finally, when it started to slow down, now it became a problem. So my question for you, do you think the slowdown is really a problem for China? Or in another way, how much of a slowdown can China tolerate, can China take?
I don't think this is a major slowdown at all. I think that this is part of their plan to rebalance their economy to become a more consumption-oriented, service-oriented economy, which they stated in their 5-year plan. They also want to rebalance it to more clean energy, and so it definitely takes time to shift entire sectors and move away from dirty energy, from low value manufacturing. And so there's going to be a lot of disruption, and clearly lots of people who get hurt in the process, getting laid off, companies going out of business. And so it's a messy process, but the slowdown is just a little bump on the road as far as I can tell. I think that as far as opportunities in China, we're just scratching the surface. We forget that, oh my gosh, this country is still growing, well over 7% a year, which is, far and away higher than anything in the developed economies. And so it would be sort of a mischaracterization to say that this is going to be hurting China in a serious way.
So, you don't believe that China will do a major stimulus package as it did in 2008, to solve this problem. So they don't see it as a problem, right? If you consider it.
No, they need to see how it's going to play out, because it's not Wall Street where they're going to look for immediate results. Things like this take months, years, perhaps, and so they're going to just have a careful, watchful eye on the economy. But no, I don't expect them to jump into big rash decisions and inflict economy with money.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. If I ask you, like my final question for you, like for this part of the panel, this restructuring of Chinese economy, what does it mean for M&A activity there? Is it going to be different? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to like slow down? How will it like influence the M&A activity in China?
Well, I think it depends on the sector again, because the official line out of the Chinese government is that they are very open to M&A activity. They want to promote it. I suspect that part of this is also to encourage their own SOEs to buy up certain private companies. And I would say that to get into M&A is sort of a mixed bag, because frankly, there's so many companies there that are just growing organically that they're not really focused on M&A. They are so busy just doing the blocking and tackling to take advantage of the growth that's already going on. And if you think about M&A, it's typically to buy into other companies to grow, because you don't have the organic growth yourself, but that's really not the case in China.
Annelies, thanks a lot. Next question for you. Your company has been very active in cross-border M&As from US into China. So we've heard again in the morning session that lots of, for example, Japanese investors are considering like Philippines, Indonesia, like more than China now. So my question for you is, for what kind of US companies need to go to China now, and what should they consider before making the move?
Well, if I understand that all the way, I've got to come back down a little bit, I think. What we talked a little bit about yesterday was the cultural piece. If an opportunity for an M&A comes up, then I think the American company has to be well aware of the cultural differences between the U.S. and China. And really, earlier I think I heard a comment about Brazil, where it's the same kind of issue, where there's different cultures. You know, it's not the United Provinces of China. So people are different from one part of China to the other. And a company that wants to go into China for a merger or an acquisition really needs to understand and spend time up front on the culture. I'll give you an example real quick. I did an acquisition several years back for Owens Corning when I was working with Owens Corning as director of manufacture. And I started with the government of a fairly rural area for an SOE. And we started talking back and forth, and nearly a year later, we walked away from the dinner table with the deal. And I ended up with both a wife and a company. I wouldn't recommend that for everybody, but it worked out for me. What happened there was I'm dealing with the party secretary of the area and the mayor of the area, and Alex and I were just talking right before this. That it was funny. We drank a lot of Baijiu, smoke a lot of cigarettes, and maybe one out of every 2 meetings, the acquisition or the what we wanted to do was even brought up. So in a culture that's driven by relationship and hierarchy versus our culture, Western culture, which is driven by egalitarian and task, we're very far apart. So the issue there is we really need to understand who we're going in to deal with, even to get the deal done.
Can I ask you, I think you're kind of bringing about the concept of guanxi or connections, right, that every China expert is speaking about probably at the conferences. So if I ask you this question, like what is more important in China, a proper due diligence by Western standards or connections? What would you choose?
To me, I think on top is the relationship. There's got to be trust. The Chinese company has to want to work with you, and you've got to build that relationship. Following that, though, due diligence. I mean, we have 2 different systems, and very different systems. So I think the due diligence part is very important. We often do that. We do the operational side of the due diligence work.
Alex, now it's a question for you. We all remember this deal, unfortunately unsuccessful by Coca-Cola in China. Like we tried to buy Huiyuan, the company, biggest producer of juices, and then China played the anti-monopoly law and says we can sell it to you, and basically the deal collapsed. Was it a precedent for other foreign companies? And in general, what kind of laws should a foreign company consider when making a move into China?
Well, thank you, Mark. Well, I think it's a very interesting case that you mentioned. Actually, that was what I think was the first deal ever since the antitrust law was promulgated in China, and that was, what many people thought was sort of a testing case to see how the Ministry of Commerce would actually implement the law. And the outcome of the case, I think, apparently had disappointed a lot of people. And my personal opinion on that is, still today, it's very hard to kind of justify the outcome. And I think, this is not particular to China, but there's no sort of detailed reasoning, justification on part of the government authorities in terms of why they reached that conclusion. So it's basically, the answer is no, you can't do the deal, and then that was it. So there is some conspiracy theory going on in terms of, retaliation or whatever, because there's been things going on in terms of Chinese companies trying to do deals elsewhere in the world, including the United States, that were blocked, on antitrust grounds. So some people thought at least that it was kind of a response to that. And but in any event, number one, we have not seen sort of a continuation of that. I don't think is a trend. So, to answer your question, I don't think it's a precedent-setting case by itself. We still need to see, more cases to see whether there's a pattern in terms of the Chinese government's sentiment to foreign acquisitions in China. And second of all, I think this is an example of the new areas of legal developments that have taken place in China in the recent past. Anti-monopoly law is just one of them. Mark, we spoke yesterday about some other laws that have come into place recently that would definitely affect foreign acquisitions in China. For example, the
anti-bribery. Is it anti-bribery law, right?
Yeah, anti-bribery law is definitely one of them. Many, its Chinese counterpart to FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act here in the U.S. And we've been helping many U.S. companies in terms of responding to government anti-bribery law investigations in China, because anti-bribery law investigation in China would almost invariably trigger an FCPA investigation in the United States. So it's really a big deal. Siemens was fined $1 billion, just sometime last year. And there's other areas, national security review. China has instituted its own counterpart to the CFIUS review. That remains to be seen, again, how it's going to play out. So I think there's quite a few new developments. And may I just add a quick personal observation on the China slowdown?
Sure.
I think the last thing we want to hear is slowing down China, because U.S. has been in a limbo for a while. Europe is in deep trouble, and what else do we need? And I'll give you my personal anecdote. I flew back from China on my most recent trip to China on September 11th. I didn't ask for it, but somehow I was scheduled on that flight. I was okay with it. I thought it was actually one of the safest days you can get. And the flight was full. It was like there's no empty seat. So I think, the fact that there is so much interaction, so many people traveling back and forth between U.S. and China, I think that's just a testament to how the relationship is still going very healthily.
So you don't trust statistics. You trust more your own eyes and your own observations.
Say it again?
So you don't trust statistics, which say that China is slowing.
I think the real problem, as Professor Li has alluded to, China has, there are three components to GDP growth. There's investment, there's consumption, there's export. So consumption, at least domestic consumption, has been huge. I mean, look at the Golden Week, the October 1st, the break. You look at a picture of Great Wall. There's like 1,000 people in a square meter. The investment has some problem because the 4 trillion package was done before in the last round, and it's kind of hard to do that again. And export really has been a problem. Export has increased just a little bit over 3% over the last quarter. So it's traditionally been an engine for China growth, and that's, I think, is really problematic.
Going back to M&A issue, are there any industries that are more protected by Chinese government than others? Are there any industries that you want, like recommend to like your clients even go into? Maybe media industry or telecoms or any other industry that is protected, like from foreign investments?
I think in this respect, it may be a little bit easier for foreign investors to go into China in terms of determining what kind of industries they want to be in, because China has something that the U.S. does not have, which is a sort of an industry policy. There's a catalog of industries that's promulgated almost every 10 years. The most recent iteration was came into place about last year. So basically, the catalog divides all the industries into 4 categories: the encouraged category, the permitted category, the restricted category, the prohibited category. For example, media typically will be either in the prohibited or at least in the restricted category. The encouraged category, for example, would include anything that has to do with electric cars, sort of clean energy, environmental protection, pollution reduction, that sort of thing. That would definitely welcome foreign investment. So I would recommend that a potential foreign investor, the first thing that, when you look at China, the first thing you want to check is look at the industry catalog.
But what about by brands in China? I think that one of the reasons why China didn't allow Coca-Cola to buy Huiyuan is because Huiyuan was a big brand in China already. So they didn't want a big brand to go into foreign hands. It is still the case in China.
Well, Huiyuan was a big brand, but honestly, I personally don't think it was such a huge brand that it sort of affects national security or it affects sort of national pride. I mean, it's the way I see it is more of a regional brand because it's headquartered in Beijing, and Coca-Cola, in fairness, has been in China for, probably 20-something years. I remember when I was a kid, Sprite was coming into China, and that was huge. That was because that was like iPhone today, So and I think it's been doing very well in China. So you got to keep these things in perspective.
Can I ask you about your personal experience in China now? Like, do you see any slowdown in M&A deals, or like do you see the growth of M&A deals? Like what is the current climate in China in terms for M&A?
Okay. Well, of course, we're operations consultants. We do a lot of operations work. But if when I talk to American companies and a lot of our clients of late, they're preparing business cases, metrics, understanding what a China play would look like, and they're kind of on hold, I think, until the next couple months, and try to see what happens then, whether it's a little more favorable or not to go in. But they're getting all their ducks lined up and ready to go.
And Lee, my question for you, we are now very close to the change of power in China, like November 8th. We're going to see like new leaders in China.
Right.
Do you expect any major changes in terms of economic policy over the coming 1 to 2 years from them?
I think they would like to have a continuation of what was already started under Hu Jintao. And of course, having Bo Xilai out of the Communist Party would help them try to get that agenda through. There was a lot of political infighting, and I imagine it's still happening to some extent as they try to bargain and jockey for power in different areas of the government. And so they keep that very close to their vest, so it's difficult for media to really glean what is truly happening. But I suspect that they would like to make sure that there's consensus in the party to continue with those reforms and not have serious objections that were represented by the Bo Xilai contingent before. And I think that what they're going to try to do is make sure that the other leaders who are fearful of retaliation and other things for corruption, that they will also buy in by sort of giving them like a one-time deal to, of forgiveness or other things to grandfather in order to buy in political goodwill so that they will have a united agenda. So I do think that they're getting close to that.
Talking about Bo Xilai case, for those who are not familiar with Chinese politics, like Bo Xilai was a party secretary of Chunxin City, which is one of the major cities in China, and kind of one of the the fast speed development areas that China was placing a lot of accent on and lots of investment in. And I've spoken to some investors there, and it's told me that after Bo Xilai was out of power, there was a kind of a silence for 2 weeks in Chunxin. Nothing was happening, and then slowly activities were starting to pick up. So my question is, if any of Al or Alex did any work in Chunxin during Bo Xilai crisis or after it, and if you can comment on what's happening there now.
Well, one of our 3 partners based here in the Junhe New York office is actually from Chongqing, but he's not here today, so I can't really step in his shoes and speak on his behalf. But I just want to sort of again share a personal observation in response to your question about Bo Xilai and the transition of power. What's interesting recently is that we've been representing U.S. foreign companies going to China for over 20 years. We've been in New York for about 20 years, mostly representing the majority of the Fortune 500 companies and others going to China. And recently, we're seeing sort of a wave of Chinese direct investment coming here. I know that's a topic for this afternoon. What I want to mention now is that what sounds interesting is that during the past few months, maybe from this spring, including right now, we seem to see that more and more Chinese companies, individuals, funds, they're coming overseas, they're coming to the States, they're buying companies, they're buying real estate properties. Last week, we were asked to help a client who's planning to buy a $50 million US dollar apartment here in New York.
Alex,
in cash.
You mean the Chinese individuals are taking money out of China because they're worried? Is it what you're trying to say?
Well, I can't opine on the reasons why they are coming out. What I'm trying to say is, as a factual matter, I think we're witnessing that more and more of them are coming out. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe it's statistical oddity, but it may have to do with the strategic transition.
After Bo Xilai case, China has started an anti-corruption campaign, and actually the sales of luxury goods in Hong Kong went down by 30% because no one dares to buy any presents anymore. So I wonder, maybe I'll ask Al, do you see any changes in terms of cultural segments of your work, and what about present as part of Chinese culture? I've been to a conference by compliance officers once in Hong Kong, and off the record they've been complaining a lot that they can't work in China properly because sometimes they are obliged to give presents, and that goes against the general kind of rules of the company and so on. So please give us a comment on this.
Yeah, I wish I could comment on that, but the bottom line is we, in general, we really talk about FCPA and what we can do. The gift giving is very common in China when you're going in for an M&A or meeting someone. We follow pretty strict guidelines with that. A cowboy belt or a hat even, falls in the right range of a gift. 10,000, 20,000 renminbi does not. So we started that, stayed with it, and it works well.
Can you give me maybe 2 major mistakes that foreign companies are making in China that maybe they would not do if they have a right consultant?
Yeah, we'll get back down to the ground again on that. I think if I was going to give you number one, it would be not knowing the culture, trying to go in, trying to do a deal.
Can you be more specific on this? Thanks.
Well, that would be not ready to spend enough time to develop the relationship. No relationship, no trust, then multiples don't even count. A lot of times it's all based on relationship and trust. The second one would probably be aimed more at American companies are really bad in a lot of ways, at least ours that we deal with, in our niche with not really developing a good business case. It's extremely important to have a plan and then work the plan. So you go in with a business case, and instead of putting it in a drawer and then jumping ahead and starting to execute, you keep that vision and business case in front of you and follow it.
And Lee,
So it's metrics, good metrics, and following the plan.
historically, it was the Chinese who were studying from the West a lot, in 90s especially, in 2000 as well. You did a book about what US can learn from China. Do you think that some of the business practices that are common in China can be useful for US companies as well? Or you consider US business ethics are is the best, and US don't have to learn from China, in this respect?
I guess one of the things that I talked about, so my book is largely sort of big policy measures. So it's not a how to do business in China book. But if I have to say what businesses can learn from in terms of what's going on there, I think one of the most important things they did was that they had allowed finance to not develop as quickly as the other industries. And they basically kept banking as a very straightforward utilitarian function and not let them engage in derivatives and all sorts of other fancy financial products. This then forces the banks to just serve the other companies, which is the historical function of finance, is to basically steer capital allocation to the best resources. So I would say that was incredibly smart in terms of not allowing enormous sums of leverage, not allowing companies to play financial engineering games, and then just focus on creating real products and services that lift the general standard of living for everybody. And so I would say that from that standpoint, that was a smart move.
And going back to M&A, market in China, one of the reasons why M&A are booming now in China is because of the very weak IPO market. So for many companies, it's easier to exit through M&A than through IPO. So what are your predictions about the IPOs in China, or in general the stock market in China? Do you think that it will kind of grow again soon?
Yeah, they're doing a lot of adjustments, changes to try to encourage these things. And certainly there are a lot of different structures in China for companies to get started, whether it's through certain joint ventures with other companies, or where they have equity stakes that are jointly shared, or they come together where one party brings in technology and capital, and then the other party brings in real estate and equipment. There's so many different ways for entrepreneurs to get started there. And so I think that with the eventual maturation of the financial markets, you're going to see far more companies try to get listed. And I think that, as the options to list in the U.S. have sort of diminished because investors here, basically, shut them out after all the stories of corruption that scared off investors. I think the Chinese government recognizes, well, we need to make room for them here, given that they can't list overseas. So, yes. Well,
Mark, I think it's going to be a very quiet period for Chinese companies getting listed here in the U.S., despite, in sharp contrast with whatever was happening, during the past few years, until 2 years ago. In China, if you're a private company, aka non-SOE, not a state-owned enterprise, it remains very hard to get listed in the A stock market, A share market, or even Hong Kong, because you have to queue for a slot, in the Shanghai Stock Exchange or Shenzhen, for example. I would, if you're a private company in China, or if you're trying to buy a private company and maybe grow it and you want to finance it, I would recommend you look at the bond market, for example, and that is rapidly growing. And also the traditional bank market, as Professor Lee mentioned, it's also sort of more geared towards the state-owned enterprises. Its function is basically the state assets to fund the state-owned enterprises, but hopefully in the future, this could loosen up a little bit. I want to quickly answer your question about the Hong Kong luxury market going down. I think the answer to that is lies 1 hour north of Manhattan, right here. Just look at Woodbury Commons. How many Chinese tourists are there? Is there any single Chinese delegation, whether it's official delegation from the government or tourism or business delegation, that does not go to Woodbury Commons? Then we can bet on that, and I can buy a lunch for that delegation.
Okay, I see you're very experienced in this field. Alex, my final question for you. When a foreign company enters China, they always have a choice: either go as joint venture or start a wholly owned foreign enterprise. So what are the pluses and minuses of both ways?
The joint venture for the most part of the past 30 years since China opened up has been the preferred or the predominant way of doing business in China, because the Chinese government encouraged that, and sometimes it's the only way for a foreign investor to get into the Chinese market, because the Chinese party wants the expertise, management know-how, and I think exactly because of that, there's been some bitter experiences, failed by the American counterparties, because they felt like, after me doing business with you, the Chinese party, for 10 years, and you got everything, you've learned everything from me, and then all of a sudden you don't need me, and then you squeeze me out, or, we represented a very prominent French food conglomerate in terms of a high-profile dispute with the Chinese beverage and food manufacturer, a producer. That was a huge case. We got 30 people working on it for the better half of a year. That had to do with exactly that. The foreign party claimed that the Chinese party was actually doing side business on their own and actually competing with the joint venture. So what we're seeing, long story short, recently is the migration from JVs to so-called WOFEs, wholly foreign-owned enterprises. A lot of foreign companies are just feeling that it's just easier to go on your own.
I can give you one more reason for this. I have some friends living in China, and apparently China changed its policy towards foreigners who are in trouble in China. So before they just kick them out and they never come back. Now they keep them inside. They don't allow them to leave until they settle their financial disputes with Chinese counterparts. Mm-hmm. So it becomes really tricky for if you're
absolutely. We were involved in a sort of almost funny case, if it's not so hostile. Recently, actually my partner worked on that. It's in the northwest region of China where there's a joint venture between a foreign party and Chinese party. In China, the corporate seal is all important. They don't rely on signatures. It's all the corporate seal. So the foreign party wants to basically dissolve the joint venture and just get out and do its own WOFE or whatever. But in order to dissolve the joint venture, you need the corporate seal. And the Chinese party was in control of the corporate seal. And the Chinese party actually locked down the compound of the business and prevented the foreign party. I think they control 51%, but they were locked out of the compound, so they couldn't get the seal. So they couldn't.
And there's only one seal, right? Only one seal, right? So
only
So no matter who, still someone has to control the seal. Probably in most cases this are Chinese side. So with this, let me open the floor for questions. Yes, please.
And two, what we're seeing right now is a mass exodus of funds out of China. They say about 70% of the wealth of China is located in 1% of the population, which also happens to be some of the most connected people there. how is this mass exodus of funds going to affect China going forward?
Who wants to take these questions?
So I think that part of the reason why some of the funds came out is probably not so different from the super wealthy anywhere in the world. The super wealthy, frankly, have diversified portfolios where they have multiple homes in multiple countries and have multiple assets everywhere, which you'll see from Americans here, from Latin Americans, from Europeans. And so I think that's just actually part of it is just natural diversification that they're doing. And so like he mentioned, someone plopped $50 million to buy an apartment cash. Well, obviously he's of the super rich and he's going to diversify, and anyone in his position probably would logically do the same thing. But in terms of some of the other funds coming out, I would say some of it actually was hot money that came out of China. And so no, it's not just the money. Clearly, as more people, the EB-5 program also reaches into not the ultra wealthy, but like the next tier down. And a lot of those people want to have opportunities for their kids to have citizenship in the U.S., for instance, and that is seen as one method for them to do that because our immigration laws are such that we have a quota that's the same for every country. And you can imagine how much more difficult it is for someone in China to come. The same quota number applies to a country of over 1 billion people as to a country of just maybe, a few million people. And so suddenly you have, a large desire of people who want to have other opportunities. And yes, they're going to have to, buy their way into it, unfortunately.
And to your second question first, Joe, I'm glad that Professor Lee mentioned kids. It's all about kids. I think when people come out and, transferring money outside is one reason, but kids is very important. Well, not kids, because most families have one kid. And also, think about Hong Kong, like pre-1997, pre-transition. Like half of Hong Kong migrated to Vancouver, to Toronto. But, all these people, after they got a foreign passport or papers, they come back to Hong Kong and they do business. So Hong Kong has been vibrant for a while. So, maybe China's going to be like that, on a bigger scale. And to your first question, I just shortly, short answer to that. I think, for a foreign investor, look at middle market in China, look at the micro cap market in China, look at look at the private enterprises, not the SOEs, the so-called these privately owned enterprises. These tend to be smaller, but they're more nimble and they probably present more better investment opportunities.
Well, I'm sorry, David is giving me the final warning that we have to finish now, so blame him for not being able to ask other questions, but obviously all the speakers will be here for the rest of the day, so you'll be able to ask them any question you want. And before I end the panel, I'd just want to say a bit about the paper I work for. We are official media sponsors of this event, and you can find copies of the supplements on the table over there. We have a great story actually about a Russia-style like merger, like from 90s there, about Abramovich and Berezovsky in London court. It's a big story and it's very interesting. So with this, I'd like to please join me in thanking our panelists today.